Today I'm going to show you how to sew a French seam with a vent, so maybe at the side seams of a shirt. And I'm going to show it to you twice. I'm going to show it to you really quickly so that if you want to rewatch this video, you can come back to it and just watch the beginning and jump right to that timestamp. Or if you want the more explained version, you can stay tuned and I will go into this in depth. Let's get to it. All right, we're going to start wrong sides together, and we're using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance in this example. I'm going to start with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so a little less than half of what your total seam allowance given to you is. And I'm going to go to the juncture at the top of my vent to my full seam allowance here, right here in a gentle J. Now we're going to clip this to the base of that sewing there, and I do this at an angle so we have these wings here. And now we're going to trim the seam allowance of the seam that we just sewed, and we're going to do it pretty close. Close down here at the base, and then you can swing out when you get up here and just tidy up the seam. We're going to iron, and we really want to get this curve ironed well. So press your seam to one side. And now you're going to put it right sides together, get the wings out of the way, stack your seam right on top of itself, iron. Now we're going to use the remaining seam allowance that we have left to us. In my case, that's 3/8. And you should be able to sew pretty much straight down and closing that seam, backstitch when you get to the bottom. Now we're going to sew our vents. We're going to press it open at the full seam allowance. We're going to turn these triangles down. And you can trim them if you want a different shaped peak. And now we're going to turn under the hem here on both sides. We're going for symmetry. Now we're going to now we're going to sew this hem. Again, we're going for symmetry. If I want a little bit more angle, I'll turn sooner. And I'm pivoting right on the seam. And now your garment's ready for a hem. All right, let's sew a French seam with a vent. So this is the side seam of a shirt. You can see my armhole here, and here's my side seam here. And the vent ends about 4 inches plus the hem from the hem there. So the one thing that is really helpful when you're doing this is knowing exactly where the seam line is, because it's going to do two things. It's going to reassure you that you're doing okay, and second of all, it gives you a target. So on this one, I'm going to be using 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to draw my line here just inside that 5/8 line. So here is my seam, right? That's my target. So when we sew the first pass of the French seam, we're going to do it just like we always do. I like to use a little less than half of my total allotted seam allowance. So I'm going to use 1/4 of an inch, and that leaves me 3/8. So I'm going to first sew my seam along here. But then when I get down to the bottom, I'm going to curve in toward the end of the seam. So it's going to look roughly like this. I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch down and then curve over, boop, just like that. And that right there is why we want that little target there. And we're just going to go at the top of our vent opening there. All right, so we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam all the way down. And remember, this is wrong sides together. And we're going to curve around just at the top of our vent there. All right, and now we're going to make a cut. So our first step, sew a J. It's kind of a gentle J. And now the second step is we're going to cut. And we're going to cut down to the base of this J, kind of parallel to it, like this. And now you can see we have these wings. So let me open this up and you can kind of see what's happening here. Here we have these wings. All right, so after our slit, we're going to trim down our seam, especially right here. If you did a nice clean edge there and you don't have any little fray things, you normally wouldn't have to trim, right? But because we have this little extra bit here and it's deeper, we're going to need to trim this down because we need it to fit inside of our next seam allowance. So I'm just going to trim this down so it looks nice and clean. And now we're going to go and press. So sometimes I like pressing the seam open, but in the case of this, since we have this curve, I'm going to press it to one side. Doesn't matter which direction you press it, just give it a nice firm tug while you press it so you make sure you're getting it completely flat on the other side. And when you get to this little curve, just poke the tip of your iron in there and pull on it here so that you can make sure that on this side it's nice and flat. You're not getting a little blump over the seam there. All right, so now on this side, we're gonna fold it right along that seam that we just sewed, like this. And we'll pull these out so that they're kind of out of our way and we can kind of see them. You don't want them to get caught on the inside there. All right, and now we'll press this one more time. You want to do that first ironing step so that you get a nice crisp edge here. You want it to be perfectly stacked one on top of the other. You don't want anything to get off. And if you don't stack these one on top of the other and you can kind of see your seam on one side, that you can see your top is getting a little bit off. So stack them right on top of each other. And now we're going to sew with our remaining seam allowance, which in my case is the 3/8 of an inch. So that's about right here. We're going to go straight down and we're going to end right here at this point. We can go like right to the base of it. One stitch past rather than one stitch before. All right, so do that 3/8 of an inch seam. And we're enclosing that raw edge that we just trimmed down and ironed. All right, and so next, let's open this up. You can see here's our fringe seam. We're right on that 5/8 mark there. It's looking good on this side here. And now we just need to clean up our vent here. So we're gonna go to the iron and we're gonna press this open. Now, if you wanted, you could overlock this edge, turn this under, and then top stitch it around. I'm gonna clean finish it as if I'm not using an overlock. So if you wanna use an overlock, you can overlock this edge and overlock your hem and do your hem. I'm gonna do a clean finish. So we're gonna iron this first, but first let's press our seam here. So it's nice and flat, and now we can press this open. We should have our seam width here, so it should be whatever your seam width was. And now we're going to turn down our wings here, just like this, and make a nice little house there, a little peak. Turn back this edge here. Press that. And now I'll just turn this under one more time, just like that. All right, so it's looking like this. You turn down the wings. There they are in there. We've turned under the next edge, and now I'm going to start from the bottom and go up. And ideally, these are going to be symmetrical up here. I'm going a little fast, so make sure you take some care there. I want to pivot right on the seam. All right, so let's see how we did. There we go. We have our vent here at the bottom of our hem, and we have our French seam, and everything is nice and clean in there. Good job.